The Mafia boss hid cameras all over his mansion to protect his paralyzed son until he saw what the caregiver did. Lorenzo Santoro sat in the back of his armored Maybach, the leather seats cold against his tailored suit, as the Chicago skyline blurred past the tinted windows. His phone buzzed with messages from his underboss about territory disputes, shipment delays, and a rival family testing their boundaries. Lorenzo scrolled through them with the detached efficiency of a man who had built an empire on blood and fear. But none of it mattered anymore. For 6 months now, he had been going through the motions, attending meetings in dark back rooms, making decisions that once defined his entire existence. Power had once been the one place where he felt in control of everything. Now it was merely a temporary refuge, something to keep him from facing the empty mansion waiting for him every night. The phone in his hand vibrated with a different notification. Lorenzo frowned because this particular app was never supposed to interrupt him. He glanced at the screen, intending to dismiss it, but when he saw the source, his heart stopped. The home security camera app. He hesitated for a second. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, Lorenzo unlocked his phone. The small screen displayed a familiar image of his kitchen at home, and the world of Lorenzo Santoro froze. Enzo, his son, was sitting on the cold kitchen floor, his legs stretched out in front of him, completely still. The boy was wearing a blue hooded onesie, the very outfit Valentina had bought for him just weeks before the assassination. In Enzo's hands were 2 wooden spoons, and in front of him were stainless steel pots turned upside down, arranged in a rough semicircle. Enzo was smiling. Not a weak or forced smile, but a wide, uninhibited grin that revealed tiny baby teeth, his brown eyes sparkling with light. His laughter rang clearly through the phone speaker as he struck the spoons against the pots, creating chaotic metallic sounds, noisy, clumsy, and overflowing with life. Lorenzo stopped breathing. How long had it been since he last saw that smile? 6 months. 6 months since the bullets shattered his car window. 6 months since Valentina bled out in his arms. 6 months since Enzo had been unable to stand again. And then Lorenzo saw her. Mia Reyes, the caregiver Rosa, had hired less than 2 weeks ago. She was lying flat on her stomach on the kitchen floor, her simple gray uniform wrinkled, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Propping her chin on her palms, she faced Enzo at eye level. Every time Enzo hit the rhythm just right, Mia clapped her hands, laughing loudly, cheering as if she were watching the greatest performance in the world. "Amazing, Enzo. You are the best drummer I have ever seen." Her voice came through the phone, warm, vibrant, completely free of pity. Lorenzo clenched the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Around him, messages kept flooding in about urgent business matters. Someone was asking for his decision on a $1 million deal. Someone was reporting on enemy movements. But Lorenzo heard none of it. All he could see was his kitchen at home, a place where a stranger was doing what he, Enzo's own father, had been unable to do for 6 long months. Something tightened painfully in Lorenzo's chest. It was not quite anger, not entirely gratitude either. It was a tangled, aching emotion with no clear name, like seeing a piece of his life he thought he had lost forever, suddenly come back to life through someone else's hands. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Because sometimes, the people who save us are the ones we never expected. The Maybach glided through the streets of Chicago. Lorenzo's mind was dragged back 6 months, back to the night that tore his life into 2 halves that could never be stitched together again. That night was their 8th wedding anniversary. Valentina was wearing the red dress Lorenzo loved, her black hair falling softly over her shoulders, her eyes shimmering the same way they had the first time he saw her at his father's party 20 years earlier. They had just left their favorite Italian restaurant downtown, the very place where Lorenzo had proposed to her 8 years before at the table by the window. Enzo was fast asleep in his child seat in the back, his small belly round and full after finishing his little plate of pasta. Valentina turned to look at their son, smiled, then told Lorenzo she wanted to take Enzo to Disney World that summer, that the boy was finally old enough to remember his first trip. Lorenzo nodded, his hand tightening around his wife's hand resting on her thigh, and in that moment he forgot who he was, forgot the underground empire he controlled, forgot the enemies lurking in the shadows. He was just a husband, a father, heading home with his small family. Then everything happened in a heartbeat. 2 black SUVs burst out of an alley, boxing their car in from both sides. Lorenzo recognized the ambush instantly. the same kind he had ordered carried out dozens of times himself. He shouted for the driver to accelerate, but it was already too late. Gunfire ripped through the night. The windows exploded, shards of glass flying like a deadly crystal rain. Lorenzo instinctively threw himself over Valentina, but the bullet was faster. He felt her body jolt violently in his arms, heard her breath rush out in a broken sound. Then something warm and wet spread across his chest. Blood. Valentina's blood. He looked down and saw her eyes wide open, her lips trembling as if she were trying to say something, but no sound came. The car veered off the road and rolled. The world spun in the scream of grinding metal and Enzo's piercing cries from the back seat. Lorenzo tried to hold on to Valentina, but the force tore her from his arms. His head slammed into the side of the car, and then everything sank into darkness. When Lorenzo opened his eyes, the blinding white lights of the hospital were the first thing he saw. His head felt as if someone were pounding it with a hammer over and over, each heartbeat bringing a fresh wave of searing pain. He tried to sit up, to call Valentina's name, but a hand pressed him back down. Tony, his loyal right hand, stood beside the bed, his face gray and lifeless. Lorenzo looked into Tony's eyes and knew instantly that the worst had happened. Valentina didn't make it. She died on the way to the hospital, the bullet having passed straight through her left chest, right where her heart was. She was gone while still holding Lorenzo's hand, while her blood was still warm on his shirt. Lorenzo didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just lay there, staring at the stark white ceiling, feeling as if someone had ripped his soul out of his body. Then he asked about Enzo. Tony was silent for a long time before answering, and that silence was more terrifying than any words. Enzo survived, but his spine was severely damaged in the crash. The doctors said the chances of him ever walking again were very low. Lorenzo closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids he saw Valentina's face one last time, saw her trembling lips, saw the light fading from the eyes he loved. He asked Tony a single question, his voice ice cold even as his heart melted in hell. Who did this? Tony answered with just one name. Victor Marchetti, the lifelong enemy of the Santoro family, the man who had sworn to destroy everything Lorenzo loved. And he had succeeded. He killed Valentina, stole Enzo's legs, and turned Lorenzo into a walking corpse with no soul left inside. 3 days after Valentina's funeral, Lorenzo ordered the complete annihilation of Marchetti's assassination team. 12 men vanished in a single night, leaving no trace behind, no bodies to bury. That was how Lorenzo Santoro took revenge, cold, ruthless, and absolute, the same way he had built his empire. But Marchetti was still alive, protected by the FBI as a witness in a federal drug case, far beyond Lorenzo's reach. And no matter how many men he killed, Valentina didn't come back, and Enzo's legs still couldn't move. After the revenge was done, Lorenzo realized he didn't know what to do next. He stood outside Enzo's hospital room for hours without stepping inside. Every time he saw his son lying in that hospital bed, his small legs motionless beneath the white blanket, Lorenzo saw the car rolling over again, saw blood splattering everywhere, heard Enzo's screams cutting through the night. He couldn't bear it. He couldn't look into his son's brown eyes without seeing Valentina's eyes slowly losing their light. So Lorenzo chose the easiest path. He ran away. When Enzo was discharged, Lorenzo turned their mansion into an impenetrable fortress. 20 carefully selected bodyguards patrolled 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The walls were raised higher, reinforced with barbed wire and motion sensors. The windows were replaced with bulletproof glass. Every entrance was secured by at least 2 layers of security checks. Lorenzo spent millions of dollars to make sure no one could ever touch Enzo, yet he himself became the one who stayed farthest from his son. He left the house before Enzo woke up and returned only after the boy was already asleep. Meals together, bedtime stories, morning hugs, all of it disappeared along with Valentina. Lorenzo hired a caregiver for Enzo, a middle-aged woman recommended as someone experienced with disabled children. But she spoke to Enzo with a voice full of pity, called him a poor child, and stroked his hair with the sorrowful look one might give a bird with a broken wing. Lorenzo fired her after a week. The second caregiver was younger, more professional, but she trembled every time she saw black-suited guards walking down the hallway, and once she screamed in panic when she noticed Tony carrying a gun under his jacket. She quit without notice. The third was too cold, treating Enzo like a task to be completed, feeding him on schedule, bathing him by strict procedure, but never speaking to him beyond short commands. Enzo didn't cry, didn't complain, but his eyes grew emptier with each passing day. like a candle slowly burning out. Lorenzo saw it all through the cameras. Yes, the cameras were the solution Lorenzo came up with to protect his son without having to face him. He contacted the most elite security company available and demanded a surveillance system no one could ever detect. Tiny cameras were hidden inside wall clocks, power outlets, ceiling corners, picture frames in the hallway, even inside Enzo's night lamp. They operated 24 hours a day, recording every moment, every movement, every breath inside the house. Lorenzo told himself he was doing this to protect Enzo, to make sure no one could ever hurt his son while he wasn't home. But deep down, he knew the truth was far more brutal. The cameras were his way of running from his responsibility as a father, his way of watching his son from a distance without facing the pain, his way of controlling everything while in reality he was losing control completely. Every night, Lorenzo sat alone in his study, watching Enzo on the computer screen, seeing his son lying motionless on the bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling without blinking. The boy didn't cry, didn't call out, didn't smile, didn't speak. He just lay there like a small statue made of flesh and bone, and Lorenzo didn't know how to bring his son back, didn't know how to bring himself back either. Rosa, the housekeeper who had served the Santoro family for 20 years, was the only one who dared to speak honestly to Lorenzo. She came to him late one night in his study, stood in front of his desk with worried, aging eyes, and told him that Enzo needed his father. Not cameras, not bodyguards, not hired strangers, but his real father. Lorenzo didn't answer. He knew Rosa was right, but every time he thought about stepping into Enzo's room, he saw Valentina, saw blood, saw the death he himself had brought upon his family. 2 months before setting foot inside the Santoro mansion, Mia Reyes sat in her worn-out Honda Civic parked outside Cook County Hospital, where her mother was lying in the oncology ward. She had just been evicted from her tiny studio apartment after falling behind on rent for 3 consecutive months. Everything she owned now fit inside the trunk of her car. A few changes of clothes, a box holding her father's keepsakes, and her nursing license that had been revoked, which she still couldn't bring herself to throw away. Mia was 27 years old, yet her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had lived through many lifetimes. Her life had never been easy. Her father walked away when she was 15, leaving her mother alone with 2 daughters and a mountain of debt. Her mother worked 2 jobs at once, cleaning houses during the day and washing dishes in a restaurant at night, just to make sure Mia and Sophia had food to eat, clothes to wear, and a proper education. Mia grew up with the image of a mother who was always tired, hands cracked from soap, back bent from constant labor, yet never complained even once. Mia swore to herself that she would study hard, that she would get a good job, that she would take care of her mother and her sister so her mother wouldn't have to suffer anymore. Mia worked and studied throughout her college years, attending classes during the day and waiting tables at a diner near the dorms at night. She graduated from nursing school with top honors and was hired into the pediatric department at Cook County Hospital right after graduation. It was Mia's dream job, caring for children, watching sick little bodies slowly recover and return home to their families. She loved every small patient like her own child, staying up all night by their beds when needed, memorizing each child's name and favorite things. After 2 years on the job, Mia was loved by her coworkers, trusted by parents, and called the angel in white by her young patients. Then one fateful night took everything away. A 7-year-old girl was rushed into the emergency room with a high fever and seizures. The attending physician that night was Dr. Harrison, a 60-year-old man with 30 years of experience and a name engraved on the hospital's honor board. But that night, Harrison was drunk. Mia smelled whiskey on his breath as he read the test results, saw his hands shaking as he wrote the prescription. She wanted to speak up but didn't dare, because Harrison was a legend at the hospital, and she was just a nurse with 2 years of experience. Harrison misdiagnosed the case and prescribed the wrong medication at a dosage that could kill a grown adult, let alone a 7-year-old child. Mia stared at the prescription, her stomach twisting in fear, and questioned Harrison once, but he brushed her off, told her to follow orders and not to lecture someone with 30 years of experience. Mia administered the medication because it was protocol, because she didn't have the authority to refuse a chief physician's order. 2 hours later, the little girl stopped breathing. They tried to resuscitate her, but it was too late. The child died in Mia's arms, small eyes closed, skin growing cold against her chest. Mia cried all night long, cried in the locker room, cried in the parking lot, cried until there were no tears left. But the real hell had only just begun. Harrison panicked when he realized his fatal mistake. He called his lawyer in the middle of the night, and by the next morning, the story had been completely rewritten. Harrison told the board that Mia had administered the wrong dosage, that he had written the prescription correctly, and the inexperienced young nurse had misread the instructions. The word of a doctor with 30 years of experience stood against that of a nurse with 2 years on the job. The outcome was decided before the investigation even began. Mia was suspended, then stripped of her nursing license. She tried to explain, tried to tell the truth, but no one listened. Harrison had powerful lawyers, deep connections, and 3 decades of reputation as his shield. Mia had only the truth, and the truth turned out to be the cheapest thing in this world. At the same time, Mia lost her job. Her mother was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. Medical bills piled up like a mountain, $200,000, and still rising every single day. Sophia, Mia's younger sister, was in her final year of high school, close to graduation and dreaming of going to college. Mia couldn't let her sister drop out, couldn't let her mother go untreated, but she had no idea where the money would come from when no one would hire a nurse accused of killing a patient. She took every job she could find, cleaning houses, caring for the elderly, waiting tables, washing dishes, anything that paid and didn't require a background check. But it still wasn't enough. She was evicted, slept in her car, bathed in public restrooms, and ate the cheapest meals she could find. Mia Reyes, once an outstanding nurse at Cook County Hospital, now lived like a homeless woman in the glittering city of Chicago. Then Rosa Martinez appeared like a beam of light in the darkness. Rosa was her mother's friend from church. She knew the family's situation and believed Mia was innocent because she had watched her grow up and had seen her kind heart since she was a child. Rosa told Mia that she was working as a housekeeper for a wealthy family who needed a caregiver for their 4-year-old son who was paralyzed, and the pay was 5 times higher than normal. Mia didn't ask why the salary was so high, didn't ask who the family was. She only knew she needed money, needed a stable job, needed a roof over her head even if it was temporary. She accepted immediately, not knowing that she was about to step into the world of Lorenzo Santoro, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago. A man drowning in his own darkness, and a little boy whose eyes were slowly losing their light. On the first day, Mia set foot at the Santoro mansion. She thought she had come to the wrong address. The bus dropped her off in front of a massive black iron gate, taller than a grown man, its sharp spikes reaching upward like the teeth of a monster with its mouth wide open. Beyond the gate stretched a winding stone driveway leading to an ivory-white Italian-style mansion so vast that Mia had to tilt her head just to take it all in. She stood there with her old backpack holding a few changes of clothes, feeling small and out of place like a grain of sand lost in the desert. Rosa had told her to ring the bell and wait, but before Mia could even lift her hand, the gate slowly opened as if someone had been watching her for a long time. A man in a black suit stepped out, tall and imposing, his face cold as stone, his eyes sweeping over Mia from head to toe as if assessing a potential threat. He said nothing, only nodded for her to follow. As Mia walked through the gate, she noticed at least 4 other men scattered across the lawn, all in black suits, all with the sharp gaze of men accustomed to violence. Her stomach tightened, but she told herself this was just a wealthy family with heavy security, nothing to be afraid of. Rosa greeted her at the front door, and the familiar sight of the older woman was the only thing that eased Mia's unease. The housekeeper led her through the grand foyer with its soaring ceilings, glittering crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings lining the walls that Mia guessed were worth more than any home she had ever rented. As they walked, Rosa gave quiet but clear instructions. The master of the house is very busy. You will rarely see him. Just take good care of little Enzo. Don't ask too many questions. Don't be curious. Don't enter rooms you are not allowed to. Mia nodded, though her mind was full of questions. Why did a house need so many rules? Why did the air here feel heavy, like the calm before a storm? But she didn't ask, because she needed this job, needed money for her mother, for Sophia, for herself. Rosa stopped in front of a white door at the end of the second-floor hallway, placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, and looked at her with eyes filled with both worry and hope. Enzo is a special child. He has been through a lot of pain. Please be patient with him. Mia took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room was larger than the studio apartment she once lived in, with a large bed, shelves overflowing with toys, and glass doors opening to a lush green garden behind the mansion. But Mia barely noticed any of that. Her eyes were drawn to the small wheelchair by the window, and to the child sitting in it. Enzo Santoro was 4 years old, with softly curled black hair, porcelain pale skin, and large brown eyes exactly like his mother's. He didn't turn when the door opened, didn't react when Mia entered, just sat there staring into the garden with eyes as empty as dried-up wells. Mia knelt beside the wheelchair, lowering herself to Enzo's eye level. "Hello, I'm Mia. I'll be here with you starting today." There was no response. Enzo didn't turn his head, didn't look at her, didn't say a word. He was like a small statue made of flesh and bone, breathing but not living, existing but not present. Mia had worked with many children suffering from psychological trauma during her time at the hospital. She knew this silence wasn't rejection, but a defensive wall a child builds to protect a heart that has been hurt too many times. Behind those empty eyes was the pain of losing a mother, the horrific memory of a fateful night, the feeling of being abandoned by a father who was still alive but never there. Mia didn't know Enzo's story, didn't know about the assassination, about Valentina, about Lorenzo Santoro and his underground empire. But she knew one thing for certain. This child needed someone by his side, someone who didn't look at him with pity, someone patient enough to wait until the wall came down. The previous caregivers had given up. Rosa had said so. They claimed Enzo couldn't be reached, that he had closed off his heart and no one could open it. But Mia wasn't them. She had lost everything, had hit rock bottom, had known what it felt like to be alone in a crowded world. She wouldn't give up on this child, no matter how long it took, no matter how many walls of silence she had to face. Mia sat down on the floor beside Enzo's wheelchair and said nothing more, simply sitting there with him, looking out at the garden. If Enzo wasn't ready to talk, she would wait. If he needed silence, she would share that silence with him. Because sometimes, quiet presence beside someone is more powerful than 1,000 words. The first week was a string of constant failures. Mia tried every way she knew to reach Enzo, but nothing worked. She read books aloud to him, fairy tales about princes and princesses, about wondrous adventures. But Enzo didn't listen, his eyes still fixed on the window as if Mia didn't exist. She turned on cartoons on the large television in his room, bright and colorful films filled with playful characters, but Enzo stared at the screen with a hollow gaze, as though he were looking straight through it. She brought toys out from the cabinet, shiny toy cars, soft stuffed animals, vibrant building blocks, but Enzo didn't touch them, showed no interest, offered no reaction at all. With each passing day, Mia felt the invisible wall between her and Enzo grow a little thicker. She began to understand why the previous caregivers had given up. Facing the absolute silence of a 4-year-old child was harder than facing tears or tantrums. At least when a child cries, you know what they are feeling. But Enzo was like a book sealed shut, refusing to let anyone read even a single page. Still, Mia didn't give up. Every morning she came into Enzo's room with a smile on her lips, greeted him even though she received no reply, sat beside his wheelchair and told stories without knowing whether anyone was listening. Then the 10th day arrived, and everything changed because of a small accident in the kitchen. That day, Mia was preparing lunch for Enzo. She placed him in a special high chair near the kitchen counter so he could see her cooking, even though she wasn't sure he was truly watching. As Mia stirred a pot of soup, she softly sang a song her mother used to sing while cooking. Then she accidentally dropped a wooden spoon, which struck the stainless steel pot and sent a sharp clanging sound echoing through the kitchen. Mia bent down to pick it up, then suddenly sensed something different. Enzo was looking at her, not with the empty stare she had seen every day, but with a real look, filled with curiosity and attention. His head tilted slightly to one side, and for the first time since Mia entered this house, a spark of light appeared in his brown eyes. Mia's heart began to race. She deliberately dropped the spoon again and watched Enzo closely. He blinked, and the corner of his mouth twitched, as if he were trying to hold back a reaction. Mia understood immediately. It wasn't words, it wasn't images, it was sound. Sound had reached Enzo. She grabbed another wooden spoon and began tapping on the pot in rhythm, creating clattering noises like drum beats. She tapped fast, then slow, hard, then soft, pretending to sing along as if performing a concert. Mia knew she must have looked ridiculous, a grown woman standing in a kitchen banging on pots like a child. But she didn't care, because for the first time in 10 days, Enzo's lips curved upward. Just a little, as light as a butterfly brushing a flower petal. But it was a smile. The first smile. Mia almost cried right there. She knew she had found the key. The door to Enzo's world didn't open with words or pictures, but with sound, with playful noises, with joy that needed no language. The next day, Mia brought 2 stainless steel pots and 2 wooden spoons into Enzo's room. She lifted him down onto the floor, placed the pots upside down in front of him, and put a spoon into Enzo's small hand. At first, he just held it without doing anything. But when Mia began to tap and laugh, when she clapped and encouraged even the smallest sound, Enzo slowly lifted the spoon and tapped once. The metallic sound rang out, and the boy's eyes flared bright, like a flame being reignited after 6 months of darkness. "Go home. Now," Lorenzo ordered the driver, his voice rough as if he had just swallowed sand. Tony, sitting in the front passenger seat, turned back to look at his boss with undisguised shock, because there was still a meeting with representatives of a Colombian cartel in 2 hours, still quarterly financial reports waiting for Lorenzo's approval, still dozens of critical matters demanding his attention. But Lorenzo didn't explain. He couldn't explain, because how could he tell Tony that he had just seen his son smile for the first time in 6 months through a phone screen, and that it mattered more than any multi-million-dollar deal in this world? The Maybach tore through the streets of Chicago at a speed far beyond the legal limit, but no one dared to stop Lorenzo Santoro's car. The entire way home, Lorenzo didn't take his eyes off his phone. He replayed the video again and again, zooming in on Enzo's face, staring at his son's smile, as if it might vanish the moment he blinked. 6 months. 6 months. He hadn't seen that smile. 6 months he believed it had died with Valentina on that fateful night. But it was still there. Still alive. Only waiting for someone patient enough to wake it. And that person wasn't him, Enzo's own father, but a stranger who had arrived less than 2 weeks ago. When the car stopped at the mansion gate, Lorenzo stepped out so quickly that Tony had to hurry to keep up. He crossed the grand hall, climbed the stairs, and walked down the corridor leading to the kitchen at the back of the house. Enzo's laughter drifted out to him, mixed with the clanging of pots and pans, and Mia's cheerful voice. Lorenzo stopped a few steps from the kitchen door, standing in the shadowed hallway where no one could see him. He wanted to step inside. He wanted to pull Enzo into his arms. He wanted to tell his son that Dad was here, that he was sorry for being gone for so long, but his feet felt nailed to the marble floor. Every time he tried to move, Valentina's image rose before him, the blood on her chest, the light fading from her eyes, Enzo's screams cutting through the night. Lorenzo wasn't afraid of enemies, of guns, of death, but he was afraid to walk into that kitchen, afraid to look into his son's brown eyes and see the reflection of his dead wife. Afraid that if he allowed himself to love Enzo the way he once had, he would lose him too, just as he lost Valentina. So Lorenzo stood there in the darkness, listening to his son's laughter from afar like a man standing outside the gates of heaven, too afraid to enter. 15 minutes passed. The laughter slowly faded as Mia carried Enzo away for his bath. Lorenzo heard their footsteps recede, heard the bathroom door close, and then he slipped away silently like a ghost inside his own home. That night, Lorenzo sat in his study, poured himself a glass of whiskey but didn't drink it, only stared at the computer screen. He reopened the camera system and found the footage from the afternoon. He watched Mia lying flat on the kitchen floor, facing Enzo at eye level, clapping and cheering every beat of the boy's little drum. He watched it again and again, 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, until he could remember every smallest detail. The way Mia smiled, without a trace of pity. The way she spoke to Enzo, as if he were a normal child and not a broken victim. The way Enzo's eyes lit up every time she praised him, like a candle reignited after a long, dark night. Lorenzo zoomed in on his son's face, staring at that radiant smile until his eyes burned. This was his Enzo, the son he had avoided for 6 months, the child he thought he had lost forever along with Valentina. He was still there, still able to smile, still able to be happy. He just needed someone to give him a chance. Rosa had been right. Enzo needed his father, not cameras, not bodyguards. But how could Lorenzo be that father when every time he looked at his son, all he saw was Valentina bleeding in his arms? How could he walk into that kitchen and play with Enzo when his heart was still shattering into pieces? Lorenzo turned off the screen, leaned back in his chair, and stared up at the ceiling in the darkness. He didn't know the answer. He only knew that tonight, for the first time in 6 months, he had seen a spark of hope, and that spark of hope was named Mia Reyes. The following week, Lorenzo changed his schedule completely. He still went to work, still attended meetings, still made decisions that determined the fate of hundreds of people within his underground empire. But whenever he had a free moment, even just a few minutes, he opened the camera app and looked toward the mansion on the outskirts of Chicago. Lorenzo watched everything. He saw Mia wake Enzo each morning with a different cheerful song, her voice not particularly good but full of energy, and Enzo slowly began to open his eyes with a smile instead of the hollow stare he once had. He saw Mia read books to Enzo, but not in the usual way. She acted them out, changing her voice for each character, making silly faces, and Enzo began to giggle whenever she pretended to be the monster in the story. He saw Mia place Enzo on the grass in the garden on warm, sunny afternoons, lying beside him, pointing up at the sky and talking about clouds shaped like strange creatures, and Enzo began to point along with her, stammering his first words after 6 months of silence. Mia. That was the first word Enzo spoke. Lorenzo heard it through his phone speaker while sitting in a meeting room, and he had to pretend to cough to hide the tightness rising in his throat. His son had spoken, but the first word wasn't Dad. It was the name of a woman who had entered his life less than 3 weeks earlier. Lorenzo didn't know how he was supposed to feel. One part of him was filled with gratitude. Gratitude that Mia had done what no one else could. Gratitude that his son was slowly coming back to life before his eyes, even if only through a camera screen. But another part, the part he was ashamed to admit, felt jealous. Jealous of the way Enzo looked at Mia, with eyes full of trust and affection that he once reserved for Valentina. Jealous of the way Enzo waited for Mia every morning, his face lighting up the moment she walked into the room. Jealous of the bond they were building, a bond that should have been between Enzo and him, his own father. Lorenzo knew this jealousy was irrational. He was the one who chose to stay away from his son, the one who ran from responsibility, the one who allowed a stranger to take his place. He had no right to feel jealous when he was the one who pushed himself out of Enzo's life. But emotions don't follow logic, and every time he heard Enzo call Mia's name with joy, Lorenzo felt a needle pierce his chest, sharp and lingering. He began coming home earlier, no longer avoiding the house as before, yet still not daring to face it directly. Lorenzo stood in the shadows of the hallway, peering through a slightly open door into Enzo's room, watching Mia play with his son. He saw her patiently guide Enzo through physical therapy, turning each exercise into a game so the boy wouldn't grow bored. He saw her hold Enzo when he cried for his mother, soothing him with a gentle voice that carried no trace of pity. He saw her treat his son like a normal child, not a victim, not a poor paralyzed boy, but a lovable 4-year-old with an entire world still ahead of him. And Lorenzo realized something that made him feel both relieved and deeply wounded. Enzo was coming back to life, slowly stepping out of the darkness that Valentina's death had dragged him into. But the one leading his son back toward the light wasn't him. It was Mia Reyes, the woman he hadn't even spoken to directly yet. The truth came to Mia on an ordinary afternoon like any other. She was cleaning the living room while Enzo was taking his afternoon nap, dusting the floor to ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound books that no one seemed to have ever read. Her cloth accidentally nudged an old newspaper loose from a narrow gap between 2 volumes, and it drifted down onto the marble floor, landing face up. Mia bent to pick it up and froze when she saw the front page. It was a photograph of Lorenzo Santoro, the man she knew was the owner of this house but whom she had never met. He was stepping out of a federal courthouse, his expression cold as ice, surrounded by lawyers and bodyguards. The bold headline above made Mia's heart feel as if it had stopped. Mafia boss Santoro released due to lack of evidence. FBI vows continued surveillance. Mia kept reading, her hands trembling. She learned that Lorenzo Santoro was the head of the most powerful organized crime family in Chicago, that he was suspected of involvement in drug trafficking, money laundering, and dozens of murders, yet had never been convicted because no one dared testify against him. She learned that his wife, Valentina Santoro, had been killed in an assassination 6 months earlier, and that their son had been gravely injured in the same attack. Mia dropped the newspaper as if it were burning her skin. She was working for the Mafia. She was living in the home of a crime lord. The men in black suits she saw every day were not ordinary security guards but paid killers. And Rosa, the kind woman from church, had brought her straight into the devil's den without a single warning. Mia ran back to her room, her heart pounding wildly, as if it might burst from her chest. She had to leave immediately. If she stayed, she would be pulled into a violent, deadly underworld. If anything happened, if she accidentally saw something she shouldn't, or heard something she wasn't meant to hear, they wouldn't let her live. Mia thought of her mother lying in the hospital, of Sophia waiting for college acceptance letters. If she died, who would take care of them? She opened the closet and began stuffing clothes into her backpack, her hands shaking beyond her control. She would leave now, before it was too late, before she became trapped in this world forever. Then a small voice called out from the next room, frightened and desperate. "Mia, where are you?" Mia stopped, and the backpack slipped from her hands onto the floor. It was Enzo's voice, the voice of a 4-year-old who had woken from his nap and couldn't find her. She heard the wheels of his chair rolling across the wooden floor, heard him call her name again, his voice growing more panicked. Mia ran into Enzo's room and saw him in the middle of the floor, sitting in his wheelchair, brown eyes wet and red-rimmed, his lower lip trembling as if he were about to cry. When he saw Mia standing in the doorway, his face lit up like the sun after a storm. He reached both arms out toward her, asking to be held, and Mia couldn't resist. She stepped forward and knelt beside the wheelchair, and Enzo wrapped his arms tightly around her neck as if afraid she would disappear. Mia felt his small body shaking against her, felt his warm breath against her neck, felt the absolute trust this child placed in her. Enzo wasn't guilty of anything. Enzo was just a 4-year-old who had lost his mother, lost the use of his legs, and almost lost his father as well. He hadn't chosen the family he was born into, or the world he lived in. He was a victim, just as Mia herself had once been a victim of decisions made by others. Mia closed her eyes, held Enzo tighter, and made a decision that might change her entire life. She would stay, not for the money, not because she had no other choice, but because this child needed her, because she couldn't look into those trusting brown eyes and walk away like everyone else had. Because sometimes doing the right thing means staying even when every instinct tells you to run. Mia didn't know where this decision would lead her, didn't know what future awaited her inside the mansion of a mafia boss, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't abandon Enzo Santoro. 3 weeks after Mia began working at the Santoro mansion, Lorenzo decided he couldn't remain in the shadows any longer. He had watched long enough, seen enough through the camera screens, and all it had done was make him feel like a thief spying on the life of his own child. That morning, instead of leaving the house before Enzo woke up as he had for the past 6 months, Lorenzo put on a simple shirt instead of his usual black suit and walked downstairs to the kitchen. He stood at the doorway for a moment, listening to Mia talking to Enzo inside, his son's soft giggles mixed with the light tapping of a spoon against a bowl. Then he took a deep breath and stepped in. Mia was sitting across from Enzo at the table, trying to convince the boy to take one more spoonful of porridge. When she heard the footsteps, she looked up and froze. Lorenzo immediately noticed the change in her eyes. No longer simple curiosity or surprise, but fear clumsily hidden behind forced calm. She knew. Lorenzo understood at once that Mia knew who he was, knew about the underworld he ruled, knew about the blood and violence tied to the Santoro name. Perhaps she had seen an old newspaper, or heard something from the other staff. That explained why she was still here despite knowing the truth, and Lorenzo felt a quiet flicker of respect for this woman. "You are Mia Reyes," Lorenzo said. Not a question, but a statement. His voice was low and cold, the tone of a man used to giving orders rather than holding conversations. "Yes, Mr. Santoro," Mia replied, trying to keep her voice steady, even though Lorenzo could see her hands tremble slightly as she set the spoon down. "I've been observing," Lorenzo continued, stepping farther into the kitchen, but keeping his distance from the table. "You're doing well with Enzo." Mia didn't know how to react to praise from a mafia boss. She opened her mouth to say something, perhaps thank you or a polite response, but before she could speak, a small voice cut through the moment. "Dad." Both Lorenzo and Mia turned toward Enzo. The boy was sitting in his high chair, large brown eyes locked onto Lorenzo, his small face glowing with uncontainable joy. His tiny arms stretched out toward his father, asking to be held, asking for the closeness he had been craving for 6 long months. "Dad," Enzo called again, his voice bright with excitement. Lorenzo stood there as if struck by lightning. This was the first time in 6 months his son had called him. 6 months of avoidance, 6 months of watching his child through camera screens, 6 months of telling himself he was protecting Enzo when in truth he had only been protecting himself from pain. And now his son was reaching for him, calling him dad with eyes full of trust and love. Lorenzo wanted to step forward. He wanted to pull Enzo into his arms. He wanted to tell his son he was sorry, that he loved him, that he would never leave him again. But his legs felt as if they had been set in concrete. In his mind, Valentina appeared once more, blood on her chest, the light fading from her eyes, Enzo's screams tearing through the night 6 months earlier. He looked into his son's brown eyes and saw his wife's gaze, looked at that small face and saw everything he had lost. The pain clenched his chest until he could barely breathe. Enzo's arms remained outstretched, but the smile on the boy's face slowly began to fade when his father didn't move. Tears filled those wide brown eyes, his lower lip starting to tremble. He didn't understand why his father wouldn't come, didn't understand why Dad stood there like a stranger. Mia watched the scene and understood immediately what was happening. She saw the pain on Lorenzo's face, the torment in his eyes, saw a man drowning in guilt and fear with no idea how to save himself. She stood up, gently lifted Enzo from the high chair, and walked toward Lorenzo. "Enzo wants to hug you," she said softly but clearly, without a trace of fear despite standing before the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago. Lorenzo looked at Mia, then down at Enzo, in her arms. The boy was still reaching for him, tears running down his cheeks. Yet he didn't give up, still waiting with the patience only a child can have. And Lorenzo, a man who had faced death hundreds of times without trembling, a man who had built his empire on the blood and tears of his enemies, suddenly felt his feet move forward against his will. He stood directly in front of Mia, directly in front of Enzo, close enough to smell milk and biscuits on his son's clothes. Enzo lunged into his father's arms, his small arms wrapping tightly around Lorenzo's neck as if afraid he might disappear. Lorenzo held his son, his body shaking uncontrollably, his eyes burning as he bit down hard on his lip to keep the tears from falling. 6 months. 6 months he had avoided this moment. And now, finally holding his child, he realized how much precious time he had wasted. Mia quietly stepped back, giving father and son their space. She watched Lorenzo clutch Enzo, watched the broad shoulders of the feared mafia boss tremble, and she understood that beneath the cold, ruthless exterior was a father shattered by grief. She turned away and left the kitchen. And for the first time since learning the truth about the Santoro family, Mia felt certain she had made the right decision by staying. After that morning, everything inside the Santoro mansion began to change in a slow but unmistakable way. Lorenzo no longer left the house before Enzo woke up. He began appearing at the breakfast table, sitting at the head with a cup of black coffee, silently watching as Mia fed Enzo. He didn't say much. Sometimes an entire breakfast passed with only a few words from him, but his presence alone was a massive step forward compared to the past 6 months. Enzo was openly delighted whenever he saw his father. The boy constantly tried to catch Lorenzo's attention, proudly showing him every time he finished his bowl of porridge, lifting his hands to ask Dad to look at the clumsy drawings Mia had guided him to make. Lorenzo responded with nods, awkward smiles, and occasionally a clumsy pat on the head. He was trying. Mia could see that clearly, even though his effort was still filled with hesitation, like a man learning how to be a father all over again. In the days that followed, Lorenzo began appearing at other moments throughout the day. Sometimes he stood at Enzo's doorway, while Mia read to the boy, listening to her voice shift with each character without stepping inside. Sometimes he sat in a corner of the living room, while Mia played with building blocks with Enzo, watching her patient guidance without interfering. He was like a ghost in his own home, present but not truly participating, wanting to come closer yet still keeping his distance. Mia slowly began to understand Lorenzo better through these quiet observations. She saw the way he looked at Enzo, eyes full of love and pain at the same time, as if every glance at his son forced him to face memories he wanted buried. She saw how he flinched whenever Enzo laughed too loudly, then quickly turned away, as if the sound were tearing open a wound that hadn't healed. She saw how he stood outside Enzo's room late each night, one hand resting on the door handle but never opening it, just standing there listening to his son's breathing in sleep before silently walking away. One night, Mia woke feeling thirsty and went downstairs for water. As she passed Enzo's room, she saw Lorenzo standing in the dark hallway, facing a large photograph on the wall that Mia had noticed many times but never asked about. The picture showed a beautiful young woman with glossy black hair and warm brown eyes, holding a newborn in her arms, her smile bright as sunlight. Valentina, Lorenzo's wife, Enzo's mother. Mia stood in the shadows, watching Lorenzo reach out to touch the photograph, his fingers trembling as they traced the face of his late wife. She didn't hear him speak, but she saw his broad shoulders shake, saw his other hand clench into a fist as if holding something back. In that moment, Mia no longer saw Lorenzo Santoro as the ruthless mafia boss described by the media. She saw a husband mourning his wife, a father drowning in guilt, a man struggling to keep living even though his heart had shattered into countless pieces. She understood why he had avoided Enzo for 6 months, because every look at his son forced him to face what he had lost, the woman who would never return, the guilt of failing to protect his family. Lorenzo Santoro might be a monster in the eyes of the outside world, but inside this house, he was only a father trying to learn how to love his child without the terror of losing him again. Mia returned to her room without getting water, leaving Lorenzo alone with his pain. But from that night on, She looked at him differently, no longer with fear or caution, but with understanding and something close to compassion for the loneliest man she had ever known. The bad news arrived one evening while Lorenzo was sitting in his study, replaying a video of Mia playing with Enzo in the garden earlier that afternoon. Tony walked in without knocking, something he only did when the situation was truly serious. His loyal lieutenant's face was ashen, his eyes tight with concern as he placed an envelope on the desk in front of Lorenzo. "Marchetti has slipped out of FBI protection," Tony said, his voice low and tense. "He disappeared 2 days ago, and according to our sources, he's hiring a professional hit team from Europe. The target is Enzo." Lorenzo froze, the glass of whiskey in his hand striking the desk with a sharp clink as it slipped from his fingers, though he didn't seem to notice. The blood in his veins felt as if it had turned to ice at the sound of that name. Victor Marchetti, his lifelong enemy, the man who had killed Valentina and shattered Enzo's life, the man Lorenzo believed had been safely locked away under federal watch. Now he was free, and he was aiming for Lorenzo's son once again. "Why Enzo?" Lorenzo asked, his voice cold as steel, even as uncontrollable rage boiled inside him. "Because he wants you to suffer," Tony replied. "He knows killing you won't be easy. But if he kills Enzo, you'll live in a hell worse than death. That's Marchetti's revenge." Lorenzo clenched his fist until his knuckles went white. He had slaughtered 12 of Marchetti's men after that fateful night, and now Marchetti wanted to answer by taking the last thing Lorenzo had left in his life. "Triple the security," Lorenzo ordered, his voice devoid of emotion, while his eyes burned with hatred. "Enzo doesn't leave the mansion. Everyone who comes in or out gets thoroughly checked. I want to know where Marchetti is, who he's hired, and what his plan is. At any cost." Tony nodded, but didn't leave right away. He stood there for a moment, hesitation written across his face, as if weighing whether to say more. Lorenzo noticed instantly and fixed him with a sharp look. "What else?" "I've run background checks on everyone who's entered the house in the past 6 months, Tony said carefully, choosing each word. "There's one person with an irregular past you need to know about. It's Mia Reyes." Lorenzo's heart skipped a beat, but his face didn't change. He had watched Mia for weeks, seen her love Enzo like her own child, witnessed how she had pulled his son back from the darkness. There was no way she was working for Marchetti. "Go on," Lorenzo said, his voice calm while every nerve in his body was drawn tight. Tony opened a file folder and laid it on the desk. "Mia Reyes, 27 years old, former pediatric nurse at Cook County Hospital. Her license was revoked 2 years ago after she was accused of causing the death of a young patient. A 7-year-old girl died from an incorrect injection, and the blame was placed on her." Lorenzo stared at the file, at the photograph of Mia taken during the investigation, her face gaunt, her eyes red from crying. He skimmed the details, about the chief physician with 30 years of experience, about the disciplinary board's ruling, about how Mia lost everything overnight. "What do you think?" Tony asked. "She could be Marchetti's spy, planted to get close to Enzo. Her troubled past is the perfect leverage for Marchetti to exploit. Promises of revenge against the doctor who ruined her. Promises of money for her mother who's dying of cancer." Lorenzo didn't answer right away. He looked at the file for a long time, thinking of what he had seen through the cameras, the way Mia held Enzo when the boy cried, the way she lay flat on the kitchen floor banging pots like drums with his son. No one could fake moments like that. No one could pretend to love a child with the sincerity Lorenzo had witnessed. But Lorenzo Santoro hadn't survived this long by trusting people. He survived by suspecting everyone, even those closest to him. "I'll talk to her myself," Lorenzo said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "If she's hiding anything, I'll know." The following night, Lorenzo summoned Mia to his study. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, with only a desk lamp casting light over the small space where Lorenzo sat. The rest swallowed by shadow, as if designed to make anyone who entered feel small and uneasy. Mia stood before the desk, her heart racing even as she tried to appear calm. She knew this meeting was not about Enzo's care. The way Lorenzo looked at her was colder than usual, sharp as a blade waiting to cut through every defense. "You were fired from the hospital for killing a child," Lorenzo said, without preamble or softening. He tossed the file onto the desk, pages filled with details from 2 years ago fanning out like an accusation. "What do you think it means for me to let a child killer take care of my son?" Mia felt as if she had been punched square in the chest. She knew this day would come, knew her past would catch up with her, no matter how far she ran. But hearing it spoken aloud by Lorenzo tore open a wound that had never healed. "I didn't kill anyone," Mia said, her voice trembling but her eyes never looking away. I was framed. Lorenzo gave a short, cold laugh. The laugh of a man who had heard too many lies in his life. Everyone says they're innocent. You expect me to believe you? A nurse with 2 years on the job, over a doctor with 30 years of experience and a spotless reputation, because he was drunk that night. Tears began to spill down Mia's face, not from fear, but from anger, from injustice, from the weight of a lie she had carried for 2 years. I smelled whiskey on his breath when he read the test results. I saw his hands shaking as he wrote the prescription. I questioned him once, but he told me to shut up and follow orders. I gave the injection because it was protocol, because I didn't have the authority to refuse a chief physician's order. And when the child died, he put all the blame on me to protect his career. Mia told him everything, about that fateful night, about how Dr. Harrison called his lawyer immediately after the girl died, about an investigation whose outcome had been decided before it began, about how no one believed a young Hispanic nurse when she stood against a white doctor with 30 years of prestige. She spoke of sleepless nights afterward, of job interviews that ended the moment employers saw her record, of her mother being diagnosed with cancer just as she lost everything, of Sophia waiting for college acceptance letters while she had no idea how to pay for them, of nights spent sleeping in her car because she couldn't afford rent. Lorenzo sat in silence, his face unreadable, but his eyes studied Mia closely, analyzing every movement, every expression, every tear. He had interrogated hundreds of people in his life, had seen enough lies to know when someone was hiding the truth, and Mia Reyes wasn't lying. He could see it in the way she met his gaze even while crying, in the way her voice shook with anger rather than fear, in the way she recounted details with the raw pain of someone who had lived through hell. "You may go," Lorenzo said after a long silence. "I need to verify what you've said." Mia wiped her tears and lifted her chin, even as her heart shattered inside her chest. "I'm telling the truth. Whether you believe me or not is your choice. But I would never, ever hurt a child." She turned and walked out, and Lorenzo watched her disappear through the door. He sat there for a long time, thinking, then picked up the phone and called Tony. "I want everything about the night that child died at Cook County Hospital 2 years ago," Lorenzo ordered. "Security footage, call records from Dr. Harrison, witnesses, everything, at any cost." 3 days later, Tony placed a box filled with documents on Lorenzo's desk. His team had worked non-stop, using every connection and method, legal and illegal, to uncover the truth. And the truth was worse than Mia had described. Hospital security footage showed Dr. Harrison stumbling into the emergency room that night, his movements slow and imprecise with intoxication. A recorded phone call between Harrison and his lawyer just 3 hours after the child's death revealed his panic and his plan to shift blame onto the on-duty nurse. Most importantly, Tony found another nurse, a woman who had been sexually harassed by Harrison 5 years earlier but had stayed silent out of fear of losing her job. She was willing to testify that Harrison had long struggled with alcohol and that the hospital had covered for him repeatedly. Mia Reyes was innocent. She had been sacrificed to protect the career of a drunk and a predator. Lorenzo clenched his fist as he finished reading the report. Rage flared in his chest, not at Mia, but at a world that had treated her so unjustly. She lost everything for telling the truth, just as Valentina lost her life for loving him, just as Enzo lost his legs for being the son of a Mafia boss. The innocent always paid the price, while the guilty walked free. That evening, Lorenzo found Mia in the garden, where she sat alone on a stone bench after Enzo had gone to sleep. He didn't apologize for doubting her, didn't offer pretty words to soften the moment. Instead, he handed her a thick envelope. "Proof of your innocence," Lorenzo said. "Enough to restore your license and sue Dr. Harrison if you choose." Mia looked at the envelope in her hands, then up at Lorenzo, her eyes filled with shock and an emotion she couldn't name. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Because you deserve the truth," Lorenzo replied, "and because I'll make sure that doctor pays for what he's done. Not just to you, but to everyone he's hurt." Mia looked at him, the man the media called a monster, the man the underworld called a devil. But in that moment, she saw only someone trying to do the right thing, in his own way. The incident happened 3 days after Lorenzo handed Mia the envelope containing proof of her innocence. Everything had been slowly getting better. Enzo was growing happier by the day. Lorenzo was appearing more often in his son's life, and Mia was beginning to feel that she belonged in this house in a strange way she couldn't quite explain. Then that afternoon, while bathing Enzo in his private bathroom, Mia accidentally noticed a small blinking light inside the electrical outlet near the mirror. At first she thought it was just a normal power indicator, but something about it wouldn't let her ignore it. After putting Enzo down for his afternoon nap, Mia returned to the bathroom and looked more closely. She dragged a chair over, stood on it to peer into the outlet, and her heart nearly stopped. Behind the white plastic casing was a tiny lens, so small it was almost invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakably the lens of a camera. Mia felt sick. She stumbled backward, nearly falling off the chair, her head spinning with chaotic thoughts. A camera in the bathroom. Someone had been watching her and Enzo in the bathroom. She forced herself to stay calm and began checking other places. Inside the wall clock in Enzo's room, another camera. Inside the picture frame in the hallway, yet another. Inside the nightlamp beside Enzo's bed, another camera. Mia ran back to her own room, tearing through everything with hands shaking beyond her control. In the electrical outlet beside her vanity, a camera. In the ceiling light, a camera. Inside the small clock on her bedside table that she had thought was just decoration, a camera. She collapsed onto the floor, her entire body trembling, feeling as if she had been stripped naked in the middle of a crowd. Mia replayed every moment since she had set foot in this house. Every time she changed clothes in her private room, someone had been watching. Every time she cried alone, missing her mother, worrying about Sophia, despairing over her life. Someone had been observing. Every time she bathed Enzo, every time she sang him to sleep, every most intimate moment of her life had been recorded and monitored by unseen eyes. And she knew who had done this. Lorenzo Santoro, the man she had begun to trust, the man who had investigated and cleared her name, the man she thought was changing. It turned out he had never trusted her. Everything he had done was simply a way to control, to surveil, to make sure she never did anything outside his sight. She was nothing more than a lab rat in a glass cage, fed, treated kindly, but never truly free. Mia didn't confront Lorenzo. She didn't have the energy for an argument, didn't want to hear explanations or justifications. She only wanted to leave this place as quickly as possible, to escape a house where every wall hid watching eyes. She opened the closet and began stuffing clothes into her backpack, her movements mechanical, like someone without a soul. Money mattered, she knew that. Her mother still needed treatment, Sophia still needed tuition. But dignity mattered more than money. She couldn't stay in a house where she was treated like a criminal under surveillance 24 hours a day. She couldn't look at Lorenzo's face without thinking of the cameras that had recorded every private moment of her life. When the backpack was full, Mia sat on the edge of the bed and cried. She cried because she felt betrayed, because she had started to believe Lorenzo was a good man, because she had dared to hope that life was finally smiling at her after so much suffering. But it had all been an illusion. Lorenzo Santoro trusted no one, not even the woman caring for his son every single day. And if he couldn't trust her after everything that had happened, then she had no reason to stay. Mia wiped her tears, stood up, and looked around the room one last time. She knew leaving meant abandoning Enzo, the child she had come to love like her own, but she couldn't remain in a place where she was watched like a suspect, couldn't live in a house filled with invisible eyes tracking her every breath. She would leave in the morning, after feeding Enzo breakfast one last time and saying goodbye to him. At the very least, she owed Enzo that. That night, Mia couldn't sleep. She lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, knowing that somewhere in the darkness a camera eye was recording her image, and the thought made her feel sick. She thought about Enzo, about the boy's smile when he banged on pots like drums, about the way he called her name with joy every morning. Her heart ached at the thought of having to say goodbye to the child she had come to love as her own flesh and blood. But she had no other choice. She couldn't stay in a place where she was treated like a suspect under 24-hour surveillance. Then a piercing scream tore through the silence of the night from Enzo's room. Mia shot up instantly and ran to him without thinking. When she opened the door, Enzo was sitting on the bed, his face soaked with tears, small hands clutching his pillow, as if it were the only lifeline in a terrifying ocean. "Mom," Enzo screamed, his voice hoarse with panic. "Where is Mom? There's blood. So much blood." Mia's heart shattered at those words. She rushed to the bed and wrapped Enzo in her arms, feeling his small body shaking like a leaf in a storm. He was having a nightmare about that fateful night, about the assassination he witnessed at 4 years old, about his mother bleeding to death right in front of him. Those horrific memories still lived inside Enzo's fragile mind, waiting in the darkness to strike whenever he let his guard down. "Shh, I'm here," Mia whispered, rubbing Enzo's back as he sobbed into her shoulder. "You're safe. It's just a bad dream. I'm here with you. Mom isn't coming back, Enzo cried between sobs. I saw her. There was blood. She wouldn't open her eyes. Mia held him tighter, tears spilling down her own cheeks. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to soothe pain so big for a 4-year-old child. All she could do was hold Enzo, sing soft lullabies her mother used to sing to her when she was little, rock him gently until the crying faded, until his breathing evened out, until Enzo finally drifted back to sleep in her arms with tear tracks still on his cheeks. Mia laid him back down, pulled the blanket over him, and sat there watching his innocent sleeping face. She thought about the packed backpack waiting in her room, about her decision to leave in the morning. If she left, who would be there when Enzo had nightmares? Who would hold him and sing him back to sleep? Lorenzo, the father who stood outside his son's door every night, but never dared to step inside. Mia sat there until dawn, torn between the sense of betrayal and the love she felt for this child. When the first rays of sunlight slipped through the window, she made her decision. She wouldn't leave in silence. She would confront Lorenzo, tell him what she had discovered, and let him explain his actions himself. That morning, after feeding Enzo breakfast and leaving him in Rosa's care, Mia asked to see Lorenzo in his study. She walked in with her backpack on her shoulder and set it down on a chair like a declaration that didn't need words. I found the cameras, Mia said directly, her voice shaking but her eyes steady. Everywhere, in Enzo's room, in the bathroom, in my room. Lorenzo didn't deny it or look surprised. He simply sat there watching her with an unreadable expression, as if he had been waiting for this storm. To protect my son, he said. To protect. Mia stepped closer, anger rising in her chest. You call watching me in the bathroom, in my bedroom, protection. You call recording every private moment of my life protection. I need to know everything that happens in this house. No, you need to control everything. Mia cut in, her voice rising. You don't trust anyone, not even the person taking care of your son every day. You investigated me. You found the truth about the hospital. But you still didn't remove the cameras. You kept watching me like I was a criminal. Lorenzo stood up, something flashing in his eyes that Mia couldn't read. You don't understand. I understand enough, Mia said, her voice icy even as her heart broke apart. I understand that you never truly trusted me. I understand that to you, I'm just a potential threat that needs to be monitored, not someone trying to help your son heal. She turned away and lifted the backpack onto her shoulder. I'm leaving. Not because of the money, not because the job is too hard, but because I can't stay in a place where I'm treated like a suspect, where every private moment of my life is recorded by invisible eyes. Mia walked toward the door, her heart aching at the thought of Enzo, of the child she was about to leave behind. But she couldn't stay. She couldn't live like this. Her hand had just touched the door handle when Lorenzo's voice came from behind her, rough and trembling, as if each word were tearing him apart from the inside. Wait. Mia stopped, her hand still resting on the door handle but not opening it. She didn't turn around. She didn't want to look at Lorenzo, didn't want him to see the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. But there was something in his voice that kept her rooted in place. A raw desperation she had never heard from a man so cold and controlled. You're right, Lorenzo said, his voice hoarse as if every word was tearing his throat apart. I don't trust anyone. I can't trust anyone. Because every time I trust someone, I lose them. Mia slowly turned back and saw a Lorenzo Santoro she had never seen before. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago was standing in the middle of the room with trembling shoulders, bloodshot eyes, fists clenched tight, as if holding back something about to shatter. He was no longer a terrifying predator, but a man drowning in grief. That night, Lorenzo began, his voice shaking beyond control. The night Valentina died, we had just finished dinner celebrating 8 years of marriage. She was wearing the red dress I loved. She was smiling, talking about taking Enzo to Disney World in the summer. He stopped, drawing a ragged breath as if the air itself had turned into blades cutting his lungs. Then the gunshots. The glass exploded. I tried to shield Valentina, but it was too late. The bullet went straight through her chest, right in front of my eyes. I felt her blood, warm on my hands, soaking through my clothes, and I couldn't do anything. I just held her and called her name. But she didn't answer. Her eyes were open, but they weren't seeing anything anymore. Tears streamed down Lorenzo's face, and for the first time in 6 months, for the first time since that night, he didn't try to wipe them away or hide them. The car flipped, Lorenzo continued, his voice breaking. I heard Enzo screaming behind me. My son was crying for his mother, and I couldn't do anything. I held Valentina while my child was terrified and in pain. When they pulled me out of the wreck, my hands were still covered in my wife's blood, and when I woke up in the hospital, they told me Valentina was dead, and Enzo might never walk again. Lorenzo collapsed into a chair, covering his face as his body shook in waves. Mia stood there watching him, the backpack on her shoulder suddenly unbearably heavy, her anger dissolving into a deep, aching understanding. "Every time I look at Enzo," Lorenzo said through his fingers, his voice shattered, "I see that night. I see the car flipping. I see the blood. I see Valentina. I hear my son screaming in the dark." He looked up at Mia, his face soaked with tears, his eyes red with 6 months of buried pain. "I'm scared, Mia. I'm so scared I can't breathe. I'm terrified that if I get close to Enzo, if I let myself love him the way I used to, I'll lose him too. Just like I lost Valentina." He stood and staggered toward her like a drunk. "I chose this life. I turned my family into targets. Valentina died because she was my wife. Enzo is paralyzed because he's my son. This is all my fault." He stopped right in front of her, close enough for her to see every tear falling, every crack in his soul laid bare. "I installed the cameras not because I didn't trust you," Lorenzo whispered, his voice barely sound. "I installed them because I don't trust myself. I'm terrified that if I don't control everything, if I let my guard down for even a second, something terrible will happen again. I lost my wife because of one moment of carelessness. I can't survive losing my son too." Mia looked at the man Chicago feared, standing before her with a broken heart and tears pouring freely. She saw behind the cold, ruthless exterior a father drowning in guilt, a husband still mad with grief for his wife, a man who had built his own prison out of fear of losing what little he had left. "I know installing the cameras was wrong," Lorenzo continued, his voice trembling. "I know I violated your privacy, and my own son's, but I didn't know any other way. I don't know how to protect Enzo without controlling everything. I don't know how to love my child without being afraid." He covered his face as his sobs finally broke free. This was the first time in 6 months that Lorenzo Santoro had cried. The first time since the night he held his wife's body in his arms. The first time he let anyone see the man behind the stone mask. "I won't survive if I lose Enzo," Lorenzo said through his sobs. "I've already lost Valentina. If I lose my son too, I'll die. Not physically, but from the inside. And I'm more afraid of that than anything else in this world." Mia stood there watching the man collapse in front of her, and she understood that Lorenzo Santoro wasn't a monster. He was a father trying to protect his child in the only way he knew, even if that way was wrong, even if it pushed everyone away. He was drowning in fear and guilt, and he needed someone to throw him a lifeline before it was too late. Mia watched Lorenzo cry, watched the most powerful man in Chicago collapse like a child in front of her, and all the anger inside her dissolved like morning mist under sunlight. She let the backpack slip from her shoulder and fall to the floor, the heavy thud of fabric against stone echoing in the silent room. But it was no longer the sound of leaving. She stepped closer to Lorenzo and stopped right in front of him, keeping just enough distance to avoid intimacy, yet close enough for him to know she was here, listening, understanding. "Installing the cameras was wrong," Mia said, her voice gentle but firm. "You violated my privacy, and your own son's. No matter the reason, that isn't acceptable." Lorenzo nodded, offering no defense and no excuses. He knew she was right, and for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss didn't try to win a confrontation. "But I understand why you did it," Mia continued. "You were trying to control everything because you felt you lost control that night. The cameras were your way of protecting yourself from the pain, your way of trying to prevent the tragedy from happening again. But it didn't work, did it? You're still in pain. You're still afraid. And Enzo still needs his father no matter how many cameras there are." Lorenzo looked at her, his reddened eyes holding a fragile spark of hope. "I'll stay," Mia said, and she felt Lorenzo's body loosen as if a crushing weight had been lifted. "But on one condition. You remove every camera from private spaces, from my room, from the bathrooms, and most importantly, you have to truly be present for Enzo. Not through a screen, not standing outside the door watching, but here, in the flesh, with your son." Lorenzo hesitated. Mia could see the fear still there in his eyes, the fear that had held him back for 6 months, that had kept him from the child he loved more than his own life. But he nodded, slowly and decisively. "Enzo needs you," Mia said more softly. He's already lost his mother. Don't let him lose his father too, just because you're too afraid to love him." That afternoon, Mia led Lorenzo into the kitchen, where Enzo was sitting in his special chair waiting for a snack. When he saw his father appear beside Mia, the boy's brown eyes lit up like two small stars. Mia took the familiar stainless steel pots from the cupboard, turned them upside down on the kitchen floor, then lifted Enzo down to sit in front of the improvised drum set. She placed 2 wooden spoons in the boy's hands, then turned to Lorenzo, who stood frozen in the doorway. "Sit down," Mia said, her voice gentle but not a request, more an invitation. "Just sit. Don't think about anything." Lorenzo looked at the cold kitchen floor, at Enzo sitting there with eyes full of expectation, and he almost laughed at the absurdity. A mafia boss, a man who ran a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, being asked to sit on the kitchen floor and bang pots like a child. But then he looked into Enzo's eyes, the same brown eyes as Valentina's, eyes filled with hope and unconditional love, and he knew he'd do anything for his son. Lorenzo stepped forward, knelt, then sat fully on the cold kitchen floor. For the first time in his life, he sat like this, not on a leather chair in a boardroom, not on a throne of power, but on the hard floor beside his 4-year-old son. Mia placed a wooden spoon into Lorenzo's hand and gently closed his fingers around the handle. "Just hit it," she said. "Don't think, don't be afraid, just hit it." Lorenzo looked at the spoon in his hand, feeling foolish and out of place. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted it. Then he struck the pot. The metallic sound rang out, clear and bright, echoing through the kitchen like a small bell. Enzo startled and stared at his father, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then he laughed, the brightest smile Lorenzo had seen since before the accident. "Hit it again, Daddy," Enzo said, his voice bursting with excitement and joy. "Daddy," the word exploded in Lorenzo's chest like a bomb. "Daddy!" His son called him Daddy with pure love and happiness, not the panicked cry of a nightmare, not the screaming in the dark 6 months ago, but the voice of a child happy because his father was there. Tears spilled uncontrollably, but this time Lorenzo didn't turn away. He hit the pot again and again. Enzo laughed and joined in, the clanging of pots mixing with the boys' clear laughter, filling the kitchen. The sounds were messy, clumsy, without rhythm, but to Lorenzo, it was the most beautiful music he'd ever heard. Mia stood quietly in the doorway, tears streaming down her own cheeks. She watched Lorenzo Santoro, the ruthless mafia boss, sitting on the kitchen floor banging pots with his 4-year-old son, tears pouring down his face while he smiled. And she knew this was only the beginning, but it was the most important first step on the long road to healing for a family that had been shattered. 2 weeks after the afternoon of drumming in the kitchen, everything in the Santoro mansion had changed noticeably. Lorenzo came home earlier, ate dinner with Enzo, and even began reading to his son before bedtime, even though his voice was still awkward and lacked the rich tones Mia had. The cameras in the private rooms and bathrooms had been removed as promised. Enzo laughed more, talked more, and began calling Daddy every day, instead of calling only Mia like before. Everything was slowly getting better, until that fateful night. The alarm tore through the darkness at 2 a.m, its piercing sound echoing through the mansion like the scream of a wounded beast. Lorenzo shot out of bed instantly, the instincts of a man who had survived the underworld snapping him fully awake in a heartbeat. He grabbed the gun hidden under his pillow and rushed into the hallway just as Tony appeared, his face tight with urgency. "Marchetti," Tony said quickly. "The hit squad breached the eastern fence. At least 15 men, heavily armed. They're moving into the house." Lorenzo's heart clenched, not from fear of death but fear for Enzo. There was only one thought in his mind. His son was asleep upstairs, and killers were coming to murder him. "Get Enzo and Mia to the safe room," Lorenzo ordered, his voice icy, even as rage boiled inside him. "Now." Tony nodded and vanished into the shadows. Lorenzo ran toward the staircase as gunfire erupted below. His guards were clashing with the assassins, bullets cracking, glass shattering, screams of pain weaving into a deadly symphony in the dead of night. Mia was already in Enzo's room when Tony arrived. She held the terrified child tightly as he cried, his eyes wide with horror at the sound of gunshots. Memories of the night his mother died were surely flooding his fragile mind, and Mia could only hold him and whisper that everything would be okay, even though she wasn't sure it was true. Tony led them through a hidden corridor Mia never knew existed, down a spiral staircase into the basement. The bunker was armored like a military fortress, with a steel door over 20 centimeters thick and an electronic locking system built to withstand even bombs. Tony pushed Mia and Enzo inside, said quickly that the boss would come after, then sealed the door and disappeared to rejoin the fight. Mia sat in the corner holding Enzo, listening to the gunfire echo from above. The boy sobbed uncontrollably, calling for his mother, calling for his father, his body shaking without restraint. She sang to him, her voice trembling and broken, but she didn't stop, because it was the only thing she could do to keep him calm. Upstairs, Lorenzo fought like a wild animal. He wasn't fighting for an empire, for power or money, but for the son waiting in the bunker below. Every bullet he fired carried a silent vow that he would protect Enzo at all costs, that he would not let the tragedy of 6 months ago happen again. He took down 2 assassins in the second-floor hallway, then another on the stairs. But as he moved to another position, a bullet tore through his left shoulder. Lorenzo went down, pain exploding as if a red-hot iron had been driven into his body. Blood poured out, soaking his shirt, but he didn't stop. He clenched his teeth, forced himself up, his right hand still gripping the gun, and kept fighting. For Enzo, he could endure anything. The firefight lasted nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes that felt like an eternity to everyone in the mansion. Finally, the gunfire fell silent, and in the terrifying quiet that followed, Lorenzo counted bodies. 15 assassins, all dead. 4 of his guards had also fallen, men who gave their lives to protect the Santoro family. Lorenzo ran down to the bunker, his shoulders still bleeding, every step agony as if he were walking on glass. When the steel door opened, he saw Mia sitting in the corner, holding Enzo tightly, her face pale but her eyes unbroken. The boy was crying, but he was safe. His son was safe. "Daddy!" Enzo cried when he saw Lorenzo, struggling in Mia's arms to reach him. "Daddy has blood. Daddy is hurt." Lorenzo dropped to his knees in front of his son, his uninjured hand trembling as it touched Enzo's tear-soaked face. "Daddy's okay," Lorenzo said, his voice hoarse with pain and emotion. "Daddy's here. Daddy's not going anywhere. I promise." Enzo threw himself into his father's arms, clinging to Lorenzo's neck despite the blood still flowing from his shoulder, and Lorenzo held him back, holding him as if it were the last time, tears mixing with blood and sweat on the face of a man who had just fought death itself. Mia sat there watching them, tears streaming down her cheeks. She saw Lorenzo Santoro, the man who had killed 12 assassins with one arm, while the other bled, holding his son and crying like a child. And in that moment, she knew she loved him, loved the man willing to die to protect his child, loved the father learning how to love after surviving hell. It made everything infinitely more complicated, but Mia didn't care, because sometimes love doesn't need to make sense. The day after the attack, Lorenzo called an emergency meeting with all the Kappa regime of the Santoro family. The conference room was thick with tension. 12 of the most powerful men in Chicago's underworld seated around the long table, waiting for a decision from their boss. Lorenzo stood at the head of the table, his left shoulder bandaged, his face pale from blood loss, yet his eyes remained sharp as blades. "I'm handing operational control to Tony for 6 months, Lorenzo said, his voice steady even though he knew his words would send shockwaves through the room. "I need time for my family." Silence fell like a heavy blanket. No one trusted what they had just heard. Lorenzo Santoro, the boss who never stepped back, the man who built his empire with blood and tears, was declaring that family came before everything else. The oldest Capo regime, a man who had followed Lorenzo since the earliest days, spoke up. "Marchetti is still out there. He'll strike again." "Marchetti will be dealt with," Lorenzo replied coldly, "but on my terms, on my time. I won't let him control my life anymore. I already let fear steal 6 months from my son, and I won't let that continue." Tony stood and nodded, accepting the responsibility. He had followed Lorenzo for more than 20 years, had been ready to die for him, and now he would carry the empire so Lorenzo could finally do what he should have done long ago, be a father. After the meeting, Lorenzo found Mia in the garden, where she was pushing Enzo's wheelchair under the soft afternoon sun. The boy was still shaken from the night before, clinging tightly to Mia's hand whenever a loud sound broke the quiet, but her presence was slowly calming him. Lorenzo sat on the stone bench beside them and watched Mia for a long moment before speaking. "I've arranged for your mother to be transferred to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where the oncology team is among the best in the country," Lorenzo said. "All treatment costs, chemotherapy, surgery if needed, will be covered by me." Mia turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise. She was about to speak, perhaps to refuse, perhaps to say she didn't want to owe him anything, But Lorenzo continued before she could open her mouth. "You gave my son his life back," he said. "You were there for Enzo when I couldn't be. You protected my child last night when the assassins came. This isn't a debt, and it's not repayment. It's what I want to do. For you. For your family." Mia was silent for a long moment, tears gathering in her eyes. She thought of her mother lying in an overcrowded public hospital, thought of the medical bills piling up with no way to pay them, and now the man in front of her was offering to take all of that away, asking for nothing in return. "Thank you," Mia said softly, her voice breaking. "Thank you." Lorenzo nodded, then looked at Enzo, who was playing with a fallen leaf in his hands. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice gentler. "I'm going to start seeing a therapist." Mia stared at him in surprise. She never imagined a mafia boss would admit he needed help. Never thought Lorenzo Santoro would accept something many saw as weakness. "You were right," Lorenzo continued, his eyes still on Enzo rather than on her. "I need real help, from someone trained to give it. I can't keep living with this pain alone, and I can't let it keep affecting Enzo." The first therapy session took place 3 days later. Lorenzo sat across from the psychologist in a quiet room, his hands clenched white, unsure how to begin. But when he spoke about Valentina, about that fateful night, about the guilt that had eaten at him for 6 months, everything broke loose like a dam giving way. He cried in that session, cried harder than the night he confessed everything to Mia. But no one told him to be strong. No one judged him for his tears. For the first time in his life, Lorenzo Santoro was allowed to be weak, allowed to grieve, allowed to be human instead of a mafia boss, without emotion. And with each session, with each passing day, he learned to name his pain instead of burying it, learned to forgive himself, even though that battle was harder than any war he had ever fought. 2 months after the attack, a miracle happened during a physical therapy session as ordinary as any other. Mia was helping the therapist with Enzo's exercises, massaging the small legs, and bending the joints according to a routine she had memorized after hundreds of repetitions. Lorenzo sat nearby holding his son's hand, talking to him to distract him from the tedious movements. Then the therapist suddenly stopped, his expression changing, his eyes fixed on Enzo's right foot. "Mr. Santoro, look at this," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Lorenzo followed his gaze and felt his heart stop. Enzo's big toe was moving, just a little, a tiny twitch almost impossible to notice, but it was moving. For the first time in 9 months since the accident, Enzo's legs were responding. The doctor explained that this was a positive sign, that the nerves might be slowly recovering, that no one could promise Enzo would walk again, but the hope was now far greater than before. Lorenzo dropped to his knees beside the therapy table, tears spilling freely as he watched his son's tiny toe move again. He hugged Enzo and cried like a child, whispering that he loved him, that he was proud of him, that he was the strongest boy in the world. Mia stood beside them, tears running down her own cheeks, her hand resting on Lorenzo's shoulder in silent understanding. That same week, Lorenzo made the most important decision in his war with Marchetti. Tony had located their enemy's hideout, a villa outside Miami, guarded by a private security team. Everything was ready for an assault, the Santoro family's most elite hit squad waiting for the order, and all Lorenzo had to do was nod for Marchetti to die that night. But Lorenzo didn't nod. Instead, he sat in his office looking out the window, where Enzo was playing in the garden with Mia. The boy was laughing, throwing a ball for Mia to catch, living the life of a 4-year-old child instead of a victim of a mafia war. And Lorenzo asked himself what he would be in his son's eyes if he killed Marchetti. A murderer, a ruthless mafia boss, a father Enzo would one day be ashamed of when he grew up and understood. Lorenzo opened his desk drawer and took out a box filled with documents Tony's team had gathered over months. Evidence of every crime Marchetti had committed, from drug trafficking to murder, from money laundering to the assassination of Valentina. Enough to lock him away for life if it reached the right hands. The next morning, Lorenzo secretly met with a senior FBI agent who had pursued Marchetti for 10 years without ever having enough proof to indict him. Lorenzo handed over the box, asked for nothing in return, requested only one thing, that Marchetti pay under the law for everything he had done. 2 weeks later, Victor Marchetti was arrested in an FBI raid at dawn. He was charged with more than 30 counts and faced life imprisonment without parole. The news spread through the underworld, and many couldn't believe Lorenzo Santoro had chosen the law over blood. Tony asked Lorenzo why he hadn't killed Marchetti himself, why he let him live even if it was behind bars. Lorenzo looked out the window, where Enzo sat in his wheelchair watching Mia plant flowers in the garden, and he answered that if he killed Marchetti, he would forever be a murderer in his son's eyes, that he wanted Enzo to be proud of his father even a little, that this was the first time in his life he had chosen justice over revenge. And as he said those words, Lorenzo knew he had truly changed. 1 year after that fateful night, the Santoro mansion no longer resembled a fortress. The bodyguards were still there, but fewer. The security cameras still existed, but only in necessary places. No longer invisible eyes watching every breath inside private rooms. The house that had once felt as cold as a tomb was now filled with Enzo's laughter, the scent of food from Rosa's kitchen, and the warmth of a family slowly healing. Enzo was 5 years old. He still couldn't walk, but his legs had sensation, and his toes could move freely. The doctors were optimistic that with persistent physical therapy, Enzo might be able to stand within a few years. But more important than his legs was his spirit. Enzo was happy. He laughed every day, talked endlessly, and loved his father unconditionally. Nightmares still visited from time to time, but now his father lay beside him, holding him close and singing him back to sleep. Mia's mother had improved significantly after 1 year of treatment at the best hospital. She still required regular monitoring, but the cancer was under control and she could return home to live with Sofia. Mia's younger sister had entered Northwestern University on a full scholarship, pursuing her dream of becoming a doctor. As for Mia, she had regained her nursing license after the evidence Lorenzo found completely cleared her name. Dr. Harrison had his license revoked and was facing multiple lawsuits from other victims he had harmed throughout his career. But Mia didn't return to the hospital. She chose to stay at the Santoro mansion, chose to stay with Enzo and Lorenzo, chose the family she had unexpectedly found while running from her past. One autumn evening, after Enzo had fallen fast asleep, Lorenzo found Mia on the balcony overlooking the garden. Moonlight filled the space, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of roses Mia had planted all summer. He stood beside her in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You changed my life, Mia," Lorenzo said, his voice deep and sincere. "You saved my son. You saved me too." Mia turned to look at him, her heart beating faster even though she had known this moment would come, had felt it in every glance, every touch, every moment they shared beside Enzo over the past year. "I know I'm not a good man," Lorenzo continued. "I've done terrible things. I have a dark past and enemies are still out there. I don't deserve you. But when I'm with you, I want to become better. You give me hope that I can." He took Mia's hand, the rough fingers of a man who had killed trembling slightly as they touched her soft skin. "I love you," Lorenzo said. 3 simple words heavy as the world itself. "And I'll spend my entire life proving I'm worthy of you, if you give me the chance." Mia looked into his eyes. The man once cold as ice, now standing before her with his heart wide open. "I don't need you to be perfect," Mia said gently. "I just need you to be real. And you've been real. With Enzo. With me. That's enough." Lorenzo pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if she were the last light in his darkness, the safe harbor after years adrift in storms. The next day, familiar sounds filled the Santoro kitchen once more. 3 stainless steel pots upside down on the floor, 3 pairs of hands holding wooden spoons, and Enzo's clear laughter blending with the clatter of metal. Lorenzo sat on the cold kitchen floor, no longer awkward as he had been the first time a year earlier. Mia sat across from him, her eyes shining with happiness, and Enzo sat between them, the child who had brought 2 strangers together and turned them into a family. Rosa stood in the doorway, wiping away tears as she watched the scene. She remembered Valentina, remembered the laughter of her former mistress that once echoed through this house, but she knew Valentina would be happy seeing Lorenzo and Enzo like this, would smile knowing they had finally found their way back to each other. Lorenzo stopped drumming, looked at Mia and then at Enzo, the 2 most important people in his life. "You stayed," he said, his voice full of gratitude. Mia smiled, a smile warm as spring sunlight. "Sometimes, staying is the bravest thing someone can do." Lorenzo nodded, because he understood that better than anyone. He had run for 6 months, running from pain, from his son, from himself. But Mia had taught him that healing doesn't come from control or escape. It comes from showing up, day after day, moment after moment, beside the people you love. Enzo raised his spoon, his brown eyes bright and sparkling. "Dad, Mia, play again." Lorenzo and Mia laughed together, lifted their spoons, and tapped. The sound rang out, messy, clumsy, without rhythm, but full of life and love. It was the sound of family, of healing, of hearts once shattered learning how to love again. And that is where our story ends today. A story about a mafia boss learning how to be a father, about a wronged woman finding family where she least expected, and about a child who brought light to hearts lost in darkness. The lesson this story carries is simple yet profound. Sometimes in life, we choose to run from pain, build walls to protect ourselves, control everything around us because we fear loss. But true healing doesn't come from running or controlling. It comes from daring to face, daring to love, and daring to stay beside the people who matter, no matter how afraid you are. And what about you? How did this story make you feel? Have you ever run from someone because you were afraid of getting hurt? Have you ever built walls around your heart? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We truly want to hear what's in your heart. If this story touched you, please like and share this video with those you love. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. Thank you sincerely for staying with us until the very end. We wish you and your family good health, joyful lives, and days filled with peace and happiness. See you in the next video. Goodbye, and sending love to all of you.